Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I think we have Bozeman and Darby and Powell County, and it looks like a full class today. So thank you guys for joining us this morning. My name is Aubrey Lyons. I'm the Director of the World Affairs Council, and I'd like to thank our guest this morning, Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, as well as the sponsors of our program, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. We'd like to thank you all for being here this morning for our Spotlight on Cuba program. And a little bit about our guest. She was the Chief of Special Interest Section in Havana, as well as former ambassador to Madagascar, Mali, and acting ambassador in Ethiopia. And she's got some Montana roots from up in Kalispell and Hungry Horse, so we're happy to welcome her back to Montana. And I know that you guys have some exciting questions and are ready to dive in, so I will hand it over to our guest. Thanks again for joining us this morning.
Aubrey, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. It's great to be back in Montana. I'm thinking I need to move back here. It's such a great place. So we're going to talk about Cuba today. If you have questions about anything else, I'm happy to answer. I can talk about Haiti and Africa and radical extremism and the Foreign Service. But we're going to start out with Cuba, and we'll try to do a lot of questions and participation with you. Last year, just about this time, President Obama and President Raul Castro of Cuba said that we were going to normalize our relationship. And President Obama changed a number of the embargo rules so that there could be more travel to Cuba, so that Americans could provide money to Cubans for investment in private businesses. And we began talking to Cuba about environment, about working together, cooperating on against narcotics trafficking. And so over the year, we have now we have changed from an interest section to an embassy. But we don't have an ambassador because the Senate has to confirm an ambassador, and the Senate is not willing to do so. And the President has just announced that there will be a negotiation for resolving the official claims of expropriated properties of Americans, which amounts to a pretty hefty $1.7 or $8 billion. So and I just saw this morning that Cuba actually has received debt relief from the Paris Club. So this indicates that Cuba is moving a bit forward on the economy as well. So what I'd like to start with is a little background. To start with, well, what's been going on between Cuba and the United States in the last 100 or so years? And how did we end up in this situation that we have a unilateral embargo against Cuba, the only country in the world in which we have a unilateral embargo? So let's begin with, do any of you remember from your history anything about the USS Maine and what happened to the USS Maine in Havana Harbor? That's sort of a hard one.
I do. The USS Maine was a United States ship that the Spanish sunk in Havana Harbor, and it started the Spanish-American War.
Well, very good. I only have one quibble with you. I agree, it blew up in Havana Harbor, and it was the catalyst for the Spanish-American War. And one investigation said it was an external, which would have made Spanish blew it up. Subsequent investigations have said, no, it was probably the coal the vessel was using. But I think we'll never actually know for sure. The Spanish would say, no. But it was a disastrous war for the Spanish. The war was 3 months long. It probably was one of the shortest wars in history, and as a result of the war, the United States took the Philippines, and Cuba gained its independence, but we imposed the Platt Amendment that said that we would take care of Cuba's foreign policy. So Cuba, as Fidel Castro would tell you, did not get its independence until he came to power. But most Cubans abroad celebrate the Cuban independence when the United States and Cuba defeated the Spanish. And do any of you, since you seem to be a real history buff, do you remember who led the U.S. invasion of Cuba and where it was? He became president.
Roosevelt?
Aha! Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider. Amazingly brave character. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he organized these Rough Riders down in Tampa, and then they invaded in Santiago de Cuba with big Spanish vessels offshore. But Roosevelt didn't let anything stop him. We went right up the hill, and with the Cubans behind him, defeated the Spanish. And then our Navy came and defeated the vessels in the Santiago Bay, where those wrecks can still be found. So that was the end of the Spanish colonization of Cuba, and Cuba had been their premier colony. If any of you go to Havana, you will see this is an absolutely gorgeous city, huge homes, elegant buildings, many very run down now. But this was where every year the Spanish fleet gathered with all the treasure from Peru and Ecuador and Mexico, and then they would cross the Atlantic together to avoid pirates. So it was a hugely wealthy country at that time, particularly Havana. So from that time, we can move forward quickly to the next big event in Cuba, which you obviously know about, which was 1959.
What was it? Darby, do you know what event that was?
Fidel Castro had something to do with it?
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, what happened in 1959, the next big event between the United States and Cuba, and Fidel Castro had something to do with it?
The Cuban Revolution?
Right. The Cuban Revolution. So, 1959, Fidel Castro comes from Mexico with, about 30 fellow revolutionaries, including Che Guevara and Raul, on a boat called Grandma. They had bought it from somebody who had named it for his grandmother, Grandma, and floats it to Cuba, where it shipwrecks. Only about a third of them survive. They go into the mountains, the Sierra Maestra, and people come and join them. And eventually Che Guevara and Cienfuegos lead 2 columns up from Santiago de Cuba, destroy the trains, and take Havana. So there's this huge revolution. Batista, the dictator, flees Cuba. There's great celebration in Cuba and great hope in Cuba. But then things don't turn out too well, especially for the United States. Fidel Castro orders the U.S. oil companies, the refineries, to refine Soviet oil. And President Eisenhower orders, was it Eisenhower or Kennedy? Eisenhower orders them not to, and the refineries are expropriated by the Cuban government. And this massive expropriation then begins in Cuba, and it turns to the Soviet Union. And then we have a new president elected, and we have the next crisis. You have to tell me which one it is.
I'm going to go to Seeley this time. Seeley, do you know which one it is?
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yay! The Cuban Missile Crisis, right. So the Soviet Union decides that they'll give Cuba a few missiles. And these things are huge, they're as big as your room there. And, if we had the surveillance we had today, there would be no doubt we would have seen them coming in because they came on Navy vessels, they're offloaded in the docks of Havana, they had to be transported on huge flatbed trucks to silos in Cuba. Finally, we saw, when we flew over a U-2, which were the spy planes then, a silo opening and could see that there was something that looked like the nose of a missile. So Kennedy contacts Khrushchev and says, we won't have these missiles in Cuba. And at the same time, Soviet vessels are on their way to Cuba with these big missiles on board. And that is the standoff. We don't know what's going to happen. Are the Soviet ships going to turn around with the missiles on board? Or will the U.S. naval blockade succeed? What happens? It's big confrontation with the Soviet Union. 1962. Did the Soviets turn around?
Who knows? Seeley, do you have an answer to that? Oh, they do.
Yes, they turned around.
Yes, the Soviets turned around. That fortunately for all of us, we didn't have a nuclear holocaust. Fidel Castro wasn't very happy. He said that the Soviets should have used their warheads. And actually in Cuba at the time, they did have battlefield missiles with nuclear warheads, which we didn't know until like 20 years later. There were some behind the scenes deals as well. It's always wonderful to see, the great confrontation, and especially when we win. But we told the Soviets we'd pull our missiles out of Turkey, because the Soviets felt that the missiles that we had in Turkey were threatening them. So we quietly pulled our missiles out of Turkey. The other thing we told the Soviet Union, and they told Castro, is that we wouldn't invade Cuba, because of course that was a concern of Castro, and that was not an invalid concern, because do you remember what happened just about a year before the missile crisis? Something concerning the Bay of Pigs?
I'm going to go to Powell County and see if Powell County knows what happened then.
Tried to invade Cuba.
Hi.
United States tried to invade Cuba under Eisenhower. Probably Eisenhower planned it, but it was under Kennedy's watch, though.
Well done. Exactly. Well done. Very well done. Very good. Actually, since you mentioned Eisenhower and Kennedy, I should tell you a little bit of the story, because, as you say, the invasion was conceived of and formed under President Eisenhower, but there was a campaign going on between Nixon and Kennedy, and Kennedy knew that this invasion was being planned, but nevertheless, he said, because he wanted to win the Cuban-American vote, he said, how is it possible that we have a communist island 90 miles from the United States? And that won Kennedy a lot of Cuban votes. So when Kennedy became president, he had an obligation, certainly many Cuban Americans thought so, to carry out this invasion with Cuban exiles. So Kennedy said okay. He was a bit reluctant, and at the last minute they changed the location of the invasion. And the location of the invasion had initially been quite close to Havana. They changed it to the other side of the island, and the Bay of Pigs is a swamp. So if any of you are thinking about going into the military or being a military strategist, never invade when there's only one road out and everything around it's a swamp. Because what happened is the exiles were dropped off on the beach. They gathered on the road to go, past the swamp and head down up toward Savannah. And Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Army blocked the road and defeated them and took many captives and killed others. So it was a complete disaster. As Cuba likes to say, the first defeat of North America in the Americas. So this was a true disaster for the invasion, for Cuban Americans, and in many ways for the United States too. And as a result, Cuban Americans did not vote again for a Democratic president until Clinton. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, they felt so betrayed that the United States had not reinforced the exile invasion with our own troops and planes. And so the next question for you, and it's a hard one, was this the right decision of Kennedy? He authorized this invasion, he supported it, but then when the crunch came, he said, okay, well, no, the United States can't support it because internationally it would be seen as a very bad thing to have the huge United States invading this independent country only 90 miles away.
I think this calls for a poll.
I think it does.
So what we'll do is, teachers, I need your assistance right now. We're going to, and I want you to poll your students. So, good idea, bad idea, yes, no. And then have one student representative please tell us what the class believes. So go ahead and take just a few seconds, and then we'll call on each school. That's fun. I can see some heads nodding and shaking and hands going up and down. Okay, I want to start with Bozeman. Bozeman, what do you think? Oh, you're still voting. I apologize. Okay, it looks like you've finished. Bozeman, would you start us off, please?
We said the Bay of Pigs was a bad idea because if you're going to invade, I mean, the decision to invade you could argue it was smart and you could argue it was not smart because of the relations with the Soviet Union at the time, and invading Cuba could have angered the Soviet Union and caused a total global nuclear war. But on the flip side of the coin, by invading Cuba, we could have theoretically averted the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we just think that the fact that Kennedy sent those people in and then just kind of left them there and basically just sent them to die was kind of not a very good idea. And that if you're going to invade a country, you might as well invade the country and fight to win instead of just throwing lives away.
Oh, that's such a great answer. It's like, in foreign policy, and I've seen it happen so many times, you do something and you don't really think it through. Nobody said, okay, what if we support the exiles and they're unsuccessful and they need our support? Are we going to be willing to invade Cuba? And of course we weren't. So that's a great answer, because you really need to think out all the consequences before you start on these adventures.
Excellent. Let's move to Darby. Darby, what do you think?
We think it was a bad idea to invade them because it caused a lot of conflict with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, it brought us, it undoubtedly contributed to the missile crisis. Probably the missile crisis, the Soviet Union would not have thought about putting missiles in Cuba had the Bay of Pigs not happened.
Excellent. Let's go to Powell County.
Are you there?
All right. Are you there, Powell County?
We are, yeah, we said no. Our group said no, that we shouldn't commit an American.
So this was a huge crisis that really shaped all the rest of our relationship with Cuba, really for the next 45 years. But I mentioned Clinton, and I think it would be worth talking about that for a minute. When Clinton was running for president the first time of the United States, he went to the Cuban American National Foundation in Florida, and he told them that he would support additional embargo legislation if they would not endorse H.W. Bush for president. H.W. was running for re-election. And they said yes, because H.W. had not endorsed this new embargo legislation that was called the Cuba Democracy Act. And Clinton gained enough Cuban votes in Miami to swing Miami for him, and Clinton became president of the United States. So the Cuban-American vote has consequences, long-term consequences, first for Kennedy, then for Clinton, and eventually, as we will see, for Gore as well. And Clinton did the same thing as Kennedy. He betrayed the Cuban-Americans, because after saying he would support them, when it came to little L.N., he did not. Do any of you remember little L.N., excuse me, I'm losing my voice, little L.N., who was the 6-year-old child who was found floating on an inner tube in the Florida Strait?
Let's do a raise of hands if that sounds familiar to you. Oh, it looks like Sealy Lake. Dave?
Tell us what happened at Sealy Lake.
Hand and saw, just explain what you know if there's.
Sound familiar? I didn't know exactly.
And so I guess what we're talking about is I think there's a lot of familiarity with it, details lacking.
Okay, so what sort of happened in general?
Said their details were lacking. I think that they've maybe just heard the name, but not really understanding.
Okay, so what happened is this child named Elian Gonzalez was taken by his mom and her boyfriend from Cuba on this unseaworthy boat, and the boat sank. But before it sank and his mother lost her life, she tied him to an inner tube, and he was found floating in the Florida Straits after 2 days, and he was in amazingly good health. He said that the dolphins had pushed him toward shore. Anyway, when he arrived in the United States, the Cuban Americans said, Elian has to stay here. His mother died to bring him here. We ourselves came to the United States after losing our property, and we've been successful here in the land of freedom, so Elian needs to stay. Fidel Castro didn't feel that way. He immediately went on television, radio with Elian's father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez, and said Elian better return or else was probably a possibility of mass migration. And then he organized these huge marches. He called them Million Man Marches. They were about 300,000 men, women, children, lots of school kids. Nobody was going into school, it seemed to me, in Cuba for the whole 6 months because Fidel organized at least 6 marches, and they would begin at Havana Bay, go down the seafront, the Malecon, past the intersection, which is the old embassy, and the name changed when we reopened, the embassy was reopened in '77 by Carter, and we called it the intersection because it was not a full embassy. And Fidel would march by, Raul would march by with their flags, their little Elian t-shirts, demanding his return. Well, Clinton decided that international law demanded that we return little Elian, because the international law says that a child must be with their parent, as long as the parent provides a good, loving home and is not abusive. So it took a very long court process of 6 months, but at the end of that, Juan Miguel, Elian's father, with the grandmothers came and picked up Elian and took him back to Cuba. The Cuban Americans were so furious that en masse they voted against Al Gore. In fact, when the Florida recount took place, a number of Cuban Americans were banging on the doors demanding that the recount stop, and the election was pushed to the Supreme Court. And who won the election? It wasn't Gore. George W. Bush won. So once again, Florida and Cuban Americans played an absolutely key role in U.S. presidential politics. And once again, the Cuban Americans would say they were betrayed by the Democratic president. So the question to you is, what would have you done had you been President Clinton? Would you have sent little Elian back, as the courts decided in the United States, or would have you sympathized with the Cuban Americans who felt that his mother had died trying to bring him to freedom?
All right, we'll do a quick poll, and then we'll have a report from each school. So go ahead and discuss that for a second and make a decision.
Interesting. See the different schools.
Mm-hmm. It is. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off with Sealy Lake. What do you think about the situation?
There you go.
Sealy, would you have returned Eliana?
Say no.
Eliana, we would keep him in the United States 11.
Yeah, just say it.
Okay. We have decided that 11 of us said that we would keep him in the United States, and 3 opposed, but the majority was 11 to keep him. Yeah.
Very interesting.
I know. Let's go through all the schools and see where everybody's opinions lie. Darby, what would you do?
Darby believes that we should have
given the child a choice in the matter instead of just leaving it up to the government to decide.
Okay.
All right. Powell County, what about you?
County voted to keep the child.
Okay. 2 for keeping, 1 for deciding, and Bozeman, I'm curious to hear what you decided.
For the most important.
We actually have a quick question. When was the wet foot, dry foot policy instated?
Ooh, we couldn't hear that. Could you speak a little bit louder, please?
When was the wet foot, dry foot policy instated?
The wet foot, dry foot. We definitely have to talk about the wet foot, dry foot policy. And Elliot was a dry foot, no doubt about that. He was taken to the United States, so that provided him with the opportunity to stay in the United States. So this is really interesting that you would have had Elliot stay. I will give you a little bit more background. The family that he was staying with was not the perfect family for Elliot. He was with an uncle, and there was not a mother in the family. And there was a 17-year-old girl who was looking after him, but it was quite a strain on her. The Cuban-American community, of course, would have, well, they did. They took it to Disney World. He was having a very good time. So I don't know. He might have told you he would have stayed, although once he saw a plane going overhead and he said, you know, Papa. Now that he's, I think he's around 20 now, he says that he's very happy he was returned to his family, and it was a loving family. Of course, you might say that, of course, being in Cuba, he would say he was happy he was returned. In any case, thank you for your opinions. That's great. It's an example yet again of another crisis with Cuba. But you asked about the wet foot, dry foot policy, which I'm very glad you did, which is a bit complicated. So let me give you a little bit of background and then get your opinions on this. In 1966, 4 years after the missile crisis, a law was passed, and that law was called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And the Cuban Adjustment Act says that any Cuban that is paroled into or accepted into the United States can adjust status in a year and a day and become a legal resident alien. In other words, a green card holder and be on a path to citizenship. No other country in the world has this, the citizens of any other country have this special status in which they are on a fast track, first of all, to become a green card holder, and then to become a citizen should they wish to. When that law was passed, all Cubans were eligible. So a Cuban found in the sea, like Elian, was eligible. A Cuban who arrived in the United States and decided to stay was eligible, because at that time Cubans couldn't freely leave Cuba. They had to escape. So in 1994, there was a mass migration of about 30 to 40,000 Cubans. And as a result, President Clinton changed the policy to what we heard from Bozeman, the wet foot, dry foot policy. And that said that, you know, if you were a Cuban and you were picked up at sea, that you would not be eligible for the Cuban Adjustment Act. You would have to go back to Cuba. But if you made it to the United States and you were on dry foot, then you would be eligible to be paroled into the United States under the Cuban Adjustment Act. So here's what has happened. About 20,000 Cubans a year come to the United States without documents. They get in rickety boats in some cases, and some lose their lives. In most cases, they are smuggled. It used to be smuggled directly to the Keys. Now they're smuggled to Central America and to Mexico, and then they make their way up to the U.S. border, present themselves, hi, I'm a Cuban, and they're allowed into the United States. Right now this is developing into a huge crisis because countries in Central America have broken up a smuggling ring that was bringing thousands of Cubans into the United States. And so Nicaragua has closed its borders, and about 1,000 Cubans are stranded in Costa Rica. And Cubans were protesting about this even in Cuba, which is unusual to have a protest there. So the question is, what should President Obama do now? Because if he doesn't change the policy, Cubans are going to keep trying to come to the United States. Because there's not much opportunity in Cuba. It has limited cell phone penetration, limited computer information access, limited opportunities for jobs. Raul Castro is beginning some reforms, but still many Cubans, especially young Cubans, say there just isn't much opportunity in this country. So they're leaving. And more are leaving because they're afraid with the normalization of relationships that President Obama is going to say, okay, only Cubans who have U.S. visas are eligible for the Cuban Adjustment Act. In other words, he's going to abolish the wet foot, dry foot policy. So far, he says he's not going to. So what would you do if you were President Obama? Would you keep the policy or would you end the policy?
Okay, you know what to do. Have a quick discussion, take a vote, and then let's hear what you decided. All right, let's start with Bozeman this time.
Can you come back to us? We're still in a heated discussion.
Absolutely. Powell County, are you ready?
Again?
We voted to abolish it.
They voted to abolish it?
Mm-hmm. Do you have a reason for that you'd like to share? Would you like to elaborate?
It encourages a lot of people to try to smuggle their way into the United States, which creates dangerous situations.
Mm-hmm. It does indeed.
Thank you. Celia, are you ready?
We vote that we should keep the policy because we think this because if we don't keep the policy, then Cubans will not be coming to the United States, and there are lots. It's very suppressed there, and we should be able to give them an opportunity. Because if they don't, then they're all stuck there.
All right. Thank you. How about Darby? What do you think?
We think that it should be abolished because we want to have like normal relations and not have the illegal immigrants coming in.
So we want a legal process for that.
So we want a legal process for that.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Bozeman, are you ready to report?
Yeah, we're good. We voted to keep the policy so that people that make it to the United States don't have to be sent back to a repressive regime.
Wow, 2 and 2. Great, so interesting to have this wave like that. And that's undoubtedly President Obama is thinking, oh, well, these Cubans don't have much opportunity, they make good citizens, they have relatives here who take care of them, they should let them come. But myself, I would vote on the other side. And the reason I would vote on the other side is because I think that exodus of Cubans from Cuba has stopped change in Cuba. Because so many of the best and the brightest of Cuba, instead of staying in Cuba and pushing for change, decide it's easier to, pay a smuggler or have their relatives pay a smuggler and bring them to the United States. The second reason that I would change the policy is because it gives Cuba such a favored status among all other countries, especially the countries that they're in now. They're coming to Costa Rica, Honduras, and Mexico. And the Cubans can enter freely the United States, but the other people from those other countries can't. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting debate in the United States, and you should stay tuned because it's just beginning to heat up with these Cubans now stranded in Costa Rica. But let me tell you one of my favorite stories. When I was in Cuba, I was driving to work one day, and I was driving the official car, which is this nice, big, black limousine. And I saw some young kids about your age standing along the Fifth Avenida, and I stopped and I picked them up, and they jumped in the car. And pretty soon one of them says to me, "Wow, what kind of car is this?" Because Cuba has these 1950s cars, great cars, but they're a little old, or these little tiny Ladas. So I said, "Look, this is a Crown Victoria, big, black, beautiful Ford." And he said, "Wow, where does it come from?" "Oh, this car came from the United States." "Well, who are you?" someone says. I said, "Well, I'm the head of the United States intersection here." And then it's very quiet, and I'm wondering if they're going to ask me if they can jump out of the car. But pretty soon this young lady says, "Be our mother, take us to Miami."
Wow.
So, this is the issue. So many Cubans see, especially Cuban young people, see their opportunity and their future in Miami.
Well, we are nearly out of time, and I want to make sure that if there's any questions from the schools, we have a chance for them to ask. So take a second and think about what we've talked about today, and think about some questions. And when you're ready, raise your hand, and I'll see kind of where we want to start today. All right, Darby, go ahead.
So we read some of the articles to prepare for this, and it said that the U.S. is like the 5th leading trade with Cuba, and how is that possible with the embargo?
Oh, a great question. Gee, I'm really surprised you know that. There are 4 major embargo laws. The first one's the trading with the enemy that Kennedy imposed. The second is the Cuba democracy that says that U.S. ingredient products cannot be part of any product sold to Cuba. So that means if Panama or Argentina sells medicine or food to Cuba, it can't be from the United States or have U.S. ingredients. It also means that the banking system cannot use Americans' money and transfer it to Cuba. The other law is the Helms-Burton that said the United States can't have normal relations with Cuba until the Castros are gone, and the official claims settled lots of conditions for normal relations. But then the other law was the agricultural sales law. And the agricultural sales law that was passed under Clinton in 2002 allows the United States to sell all agricultural products to Cuba, from timber to wheat to chickens to corn. And that's why we're number 5. That same law, however, says that tourism to Cuba is illegal. It's actually a law. So as a result, when President Obama changed the embargo regulations, he made categories of people who can travel to Cuba for humanitarian, for religious, for educational, for cultural, for journalism, for a whole variety of reasons to allow Americans to travel, because he can't change the law. Congress has to change the law. So we now have at least 4 laws that Congress will have to change if we are to have normal relations with Cuba. So thank you for that good question. It's because of the agricultural sales. Other questions?
Celie, go ahead.
Okay. Why haven't the U.S. and Cuba tried to reach out to each other before now?
Another good question. We have. For example, President Clinton had modified the embargo regulations, allowed more travel in the second half of his second term. And he was hoping that this would progress. And this is actually when I went to Cuba. But little LN just stopped the whole thing, because Fidel Castro was much more interested in having this great cause against the Cuban Americans over the child Elian than he was in pursuing a normalization of relations with the United States. Actually, when Jimmy Carter opened up the intersection, the embassy is this beautiful building that was built in the mid-50s. It looks like the United Nations, a little United Nations, because it was built by the same architectural firm. And the embassy, after it was closed and then reopened by Carter, was called the intersection. We were still in the same building, but it was called the intersection. Now that Obama has normalized relations, the same building is called the embassy. So embassy, intersection, embassy. Anyway, I'm losing my train of thought.
It was, why haven't we tried to heal? Yeah.
So Carter normalized relations in that he allowed for the intersection and he allowed travel to Cuba. And then Cuba sent troops to Africa. And in fact, Cuba is probably the only foreign country that wins wars in Africa. And the Cuban troops defeated the South Africans and gained the independence for Namibia and pushed the South Africans out of Namibia. And they also fought with the Ethiopians and defeated the Somalis. So we were unhappy with Cuba and the Soviet Union for sending troops to Africa, and that closed down that opportunity in 1977. So there's been repeated opportunities, and I'm so glad you asked the question, because everything Obama has done so far can be reversed by the next president of the United States if he doesn't care for the policy.
Interesting. All right, let's see.